Next, please welcome Srishti Hukku. Srishti, she, they, theirs, has Kashmiri roots, was raised in Silicon Valley and now calls Canada home. She recently became the youngest and only racialized accredited humanist chaplain in Canada. In addition, as a lifetime member of Humanist Canada, Srishti serves on several committees, including those advancing access to secular chaplaincy, sexual and reproductive health, critical thinking, DEI, and intersectionality. Srishti is also a humanist officiant, providing a range of ceremonies from child/adult namings to weddings to celebration of life services. As a global citizen, she actively supports the American Humanist Association, Humanist UK, Humanist Australia, and Humanist International. A lifelong learner, Srishti is a co-tutelle doctoral candidate at the University of Ottawa's Population Health Program and the Medical Anthropology Program at Macquarie University in Australia, exploring the intersection between sexual and reproductive health issues and secular public policy. Please welcome Srishti Hukku.
Wow, thank you so much for that warm welcome. And I'd like to start by saying what a group, what a powerful conversation we're just coming into. And I hope to build on some of the great ideas that Char's already started us off with. So a big applause to all of the presenters, all of you who are amazing for being here on a weekend. And a big thanks to Mandisa, the other organizers, the conference staff, everyone who's working behind the scenes to make this possible. Conferences are so much work, and I'm just grateful to be here with all of you. I apologize in advance for not being able to join you in person. I was really desperately writing to Mandisa for months, eager to come join all of you in person, but unfortunately I tested positive for COVID a few days ago. And so I ask you to bear with me and my sniffles as I try and make it through the presentation. I'd also like to extend a big thank you before I start to Martin Frith, who's the president of Humanist Canada, for supporting me being here and for all of the work he supports me in doing as part of a member of the organization. So let me start by getting some of the technicalities out of the way. The opinions that are expressed in this presentation are really reflective of just my views and don't reflect the views of any organization with which I may be affiliated. In terms of pronouns, I don't generally use them, so I invite you to use my name or anything respectful. And if you have any questions or concerns about anything that I'm saying, I always invite conversation. I'd welcome some during the Q&A period, depending on how much time we have. But you can also always send me a message through my website at srishtihukku.ca. I'll have that up on the last slide because I know it's not easy to spell. So the focus of this conference on activism, feminism, and secularism is so powerful for me personally because it is such an honor to be able to be part of building this community and be part of creating spaces where we can discuss some of the really important issues that we've already been discussing today and last night, with openness and by bringing our non-belief front and center. With yesterday being Canada's National Day for Truth and Reconciliation with our Indigenous peoples, I would be remiss to not mention and acknowledge the stewardship of the land, both here in Ottawa, Canada, but also in Chicago by a number of different Indigenous peoples. It is in this regard that I want to invite all of us to take a moment to just reflect on a series of collective traumas that we faced over the last few years and what those traumas really mean. And the beauty of having this space, the WOCBB conference this weekend. So we've seen COVID and all of the related deaths and global suffering. We saw the murder of George Floyd and too many others like Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor. We see again and again the impacts of dogmatic ideology on the reversal of access to bodily autonomy through Roe. And we also see the persistent attacks on non-believers like ourselves, like Salman Rushdie, just before he was slated to give public remarks in New York. And of course, as I mentioned, we see the tragic legacy of the residential school system, religion, and the related racism as we discovered the unmarked graves of hundreds of Indigenous children. For me, and I hope for you, these events remind you of the pernicious nature of hate in our society and the fragility of our civil liberties. From my perspective, it is exactly through the isms that we're talking about through this conference, activism, our feminism, and our secularism, that we can combat together these forces that are at play. And I hope to do just that in the next 10 minutes or so by walking you through my story personally, giving you an overview of diversity, equity, and inclusion in Canada, and then taking a moment to share gratitude communally. Excuse me. So, who am I and what do I know about diversity, equity, and inclusion within humanism in Canada? As you already heard, I have a fairly unique life story, and I believe that as a community, beyond belief, we have many things in common, and we also have unique experiences that bring us to our personal perspectives and set of biases. And so I think it's important to acknowledge these front and center so that we can address our unique combination of privileges and oppressions with those that we meet. So for me specifically, this means that my family is historically Kashmiri. And for those of you who are unaware, Kashmir is the most militarized zone in the world. My community, the Kashmiri community, has experienced a lot of intergenerational trauma. We've lost access to our mother tongue of Kashmiri, and we're internally displaced due to ongoing religious conflict and related genocide. My Nana, or maternal grandfather, who you see pictured on the left of the screen, in an attempt to escape poverty, moved my mother and his young family to Liberia. My mom spent her formative years in American and British schools, not really learning anything about her Kashmiri roots. And she lived there until the military coup forced my family to Delhi. She eventually met my father, you can see pictured in the middle picture. And they had an arranged marriage. And I think they were both shocked to learn that given their very divergent life experiences, that their marriage was actually a multicultural one. In an effort to escape poverty, my father, as an economic immigrant, moved us all to California when I was 6 years old. There, I'm pictured there, all sass. I grew up in Silicon Valley, which all of you know is full of newcomers, and I had a best friend who was Japanese and saw all sorts of diversity all around me. But I really had no sense of it and didn't think that there was anything unique about my story. As far as I knew, I was living the American dream just like everyone else. But as I grew up in the US, I began to seek religious freedom. And I firmly came to believe that I could not be connected to the religious traditions of my family, neither the Kashmiri part being Hindu or the Liberian part being predominantly devoutly Christian. Eventually, my family moved to Ottawa, which about 20 years ago had the population of 700,000. And like the snow that we feel we have almost year round, was a predominantly homogenous and mostly white city. And as you can imagine, I faced a lot of discrimination. My name, Srishti, which means creation, stood out right from the get-go. And I embodied a breadth of cultures, which represented something very obviously different and other from the rest of the people that I met. I quickly found out that I wasn't Kashmiri enough. I didn't speak the language. I didn't understand the religious or cultural or partake in the traditions. I was definitely not Liberian enough, and I was a little too American for anybody's taste. So as I share my story with you humbly today, I just think that what I want to really convey is that my journey, although it's been steeped with a lot of privilege, having the opportunity to be educated primarily in the West, in the US and Canada and Australia and Sweden, there is a lot of suffering that is part of that story, being the nonconformer that I am. And I face significant challenges in finding a sense of community. So I'm so grateful to all of you. Over the last decade, this has been further exacerbated as I continue to challenge some of the norms that we see in society. I'm unmarried, I don't have children, and as you heard through my doctoral work, I think about some pretty radical things like artificial wombs that separate gestation entirely from the human body. So now that you know a little bit about me, let's turn to the diversity, equity, and inclusion story in Canada. Being the nerdy researcher that I am, I was so excited to be able to go out to the Humanist Canada membership community and not only share with you my views on DEI, but actually speak to community members about what they thought. So I had the opportunity to conduct a qualitative survey with members, and it was our most successful survey to date. We had 111 participants, and I want to walk you through some of the findings. So in terms of demographics of the 111 people that participated, almost 93% were over 35 years of age. Almost 59% of participants identified as cisgender men, with fewer than 2.7% identifying as another gender, such as gender non-binary or agender. Notably, we didn't have any trans folks participate in our survey. Over 89% of those who participated identified as white, Caucasian, or having European descent. And the remaining 11%, so a very small fraction of the 111, identified as Black, East Asian, Asian, South Asian, Inuit, Métis, Latin American, or mixed. So you can imagine there were one or two folks in each of those categories, and so I couldn't break down the data any further. Almost 2/3 of our survey participants identified as humanist, with the next largest group being atheists at 24%, and the remainder identified as agnostic, skeptics, or freethinkers, or nones. So now that you know a little bit about who participated, let me tell you what they had to say about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Fortunately, the majority of our survey participants, like the ones pictured on the screen here, were supportive of diversity, equity, and inclusion, not only in Canada, but also as a pillar of secular thought. Most participants also had a really strong understanding of social justice and supported it as part of a non-believing worldview. These participants also focused on equity and removing barriers for a range of marginalized groups in all parts of society through making sure that everyone had equal access to opportunities. However, it's not all good news. Unfortunately, we did have a minority of participants that felt that diversity, equity, and inclusion and social justice were undesirable. They felt that these concepts were more about virtue signaling and that they were based on some sort of misunderstanding of reality. Some members went so far as to say that they actually had a fake acceptance of DEI in our circles because they didn't want to be held accountable publicly within the community. I think from my perspective, what's most scary about some of these sentiments is that they're not in the parts of the population that we would expect, perhaps the older parts. You can see that younger humanists are actually saying some of these same things and feeling some of these same things. So in terms of women's rights, the majority of participants felt that they were the same as human rights, and that as humanists, we had a lot to do still to advance not only women's rights, but also the rights of people of all marginalized genders. Nonetheless, once again, there was a minority of survey participants that did make disparaging comments about women's rights because they'd already been won, because of the disenfranchisement that they felt of men, and there were a number of transphobic comments, unfortunately. It's important to, from my perspective, acknowledge these and that they exist within our communities so that we can work towards combating systemic hate, discrimination, and the all too easy default of dehumanizing one another. So what is Humanist Canada doing to combat some of these things? Well, to combat these types of beliefs, with my support and the support of a great leadership team in Martin and the board, we've really been focused on centering intersectionality. We're working on actively ensuring that we recruit diverse service providers for officiating secular rituals as part of our officiant program. We also emphasize performing ceremonies for people of all genders, using gender neutral language, and we ask our officiants to think about complex issues like ability and disability and neurodiversity when they're thinking about how they're planning any ceremonies that they're creating. We've also been having some breakthroughs in terms of our Humanist Chaplaincy program, which launched for the first time just last year in Canada. We're making spaces that have traditionally been occupied by religious folks radically more inclusive just by being present. Our ability to provide secular services has been really well received, not only in a few universities across Canada, but also in the Canadian Armed Forces. And although at this moment in time, I'm the only racialized chaplain, as part of our chaplaincy training, we continue to emphasize intersectionality, as well as using more inclusive language by steering clear of terms like spiritual care and really focusing on the Canadian model of 4 E's. The 4 E's we describe are basically centering chaplains as liminal guides as folks go through existential, emotional, ethical, and equity challenges as part of our daily lives. Most recently, we've also been doing some really fun work by getting out and participating in pride parades and making sure that we center people of color who are part of the queer community. And we've been emphasizing in all of our messaging that human rights are in fact 2S LGBTQ plus rights. In Canada, we start with the 2S because we talk about Two-Spirit folks, which is an Indigenous gender affiliation. So where do we go from here? Some of you may have seen this photo. Here you'll see our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, taking a knee at the Black Lives Matter protests that happened a few years ago. He has also publicly acknowledged that racism continues to be a huge problem in Canada and has made commitments publicly to advancing the rights of women and girls, ensuring continued access to safe abortion, and to combating hate. From my perspective, leadership within our own community also needs to make similar commitments because, as we've seen from the results of my survey and just in conversation with those within our community, there's not only a ton of work to be done within society broadly, but within the non-belief movement as well. So from my perspective, we already do this as humanists or as non-believers. We start from a place of compassion and care. And I think we can continue to do this by centering things that we've already been talking about, like increasing gender and 2S LGBTIQIA+ literacy, integrating intersectionality in everything that we do, making sure that we talk about positionality and reflexivity so that people can reflect on their own privileges and privileges and oppressions of others, by including the work of Kimberly Crenshaw, and also by centering reproductive justice in humanism, by understanding the work of people like Loretta J. Ross, as I'm sure all of you know, a survivor of childhood rape and incest. I think we also need to acknowledge the harms created by racialization, by colorism, by patriarchy, by misogyny, and by all of the normativities that we've already been talking about. So whether that's heteronormativity, cisnormativity, monogamy, gender normativity, we need to continue to challenge these within our movement. And most importantly, I think we need to really change the way that we write history by centering the stories of people like us who often disappear in the way history has been written up until now. And I know many of you are already doing this, whether it's through books or through social media or through podcasts. As one of the international delegates at this conference, I really want to end my remarks by highlighting the importance of increasing collaboration between American and Canadian communities. As you heard from my personal story, it's personally important to me, but I think we are stronger together as we fight through some of the similar challenges in our societies. I think we also need to create communities like Women of Color Beyond Belief in Canada and learn from the great work that's being done here. We need to support folks with mentorship and scholarships and anything that can help advance them within our movements. And we need to increase representation on humanist boards. We also need to continue to increase representation in terms of service providers like officiants and chaplains so that our members really reflect the diversity within our communities. And I really believe that by doing this work collaboratively, we can enhance equity, not only at a personal level, but at a regional and global level. And lastly, I want to thank all of you. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I want to take a moment for us to celebrate as a community. So many of us do this work tirelessly, with a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. And so I want you to take a moment around, I can't see the room, but find a neighbor and, or virtually in Zoom, thank each other for being here. Thank you for the activism that you're already doing. And thank you for being committed to making the world a much better place.